Hello, my name is Fareed Khan. I'm the founder of the anti-racism activist group Canadians United Against Hate and Director of Advocacy and Media Relations for the Rohingya Human Rights Network. I'd like to welcome viewers to Diversity Dialogue, conversations with prominent people who work in the area of human rights and anti-racism. Today we will be speaking with Tom Woodley, who is the president of the Montreal-based NGO Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. Tom has a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from Carnegie Mellon University and a master's degree in the same field from the Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey. He also has a master's in public administration from Indiana University's School of Public and Environmental Affairs. Tom has considerable experience in the public sector, having worked for the federal government for a number of years. In addition, he has a long history working in the NGO and volunteer sector, having volunteered for several international NGOs in Africa and the Middle East. Tom has been involved with CJPME since its founding in 2004. Welcome to Diversity Dialogue, Tom.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I will start out just for transparency to say that Tom and I have worked together before on a number of human rights and anti-racism issues, and I have supported the work of CJPME. So Tom, before we begin, could you please explain to viewers how CJPME came to be?
Sure. Well, we were founded in 2004, like you say. We actually, prior to that, we had been doing some humanitarian fundraising to help the Palestinians. My wife is a Palestinian Canadian, and so that was sort of the initial connection. But we had lots of friends who were Palestinian and from the Middle East, and we were all concerned about the humanitarian situation of the Palestinians. So we actually did 2 or 3 major projects, humanitarian, where we raised money. In one case, we equipped a surgical unit in outside Hebron. Another case, we helped an agricultural project outside of Nahalin. Both projects, we raised over $100,000 Canadian to help fund those projects. But after a point, we realized, there's it's not like an earthquake hit Palestine. It's not like there was a tsunami that hit Palestine. Palestinians live, impoverished lives, restricted lives because of the political situation, because of Israel's occupation and oppression, and because the international community puts up with it. And so we felt it would be better to have a focus on more the policy side and change the politics around the situation. One of the biggest things that we feel we need to do is just help educate the public as to what's actually going on there, help people understand the historical context. So those are our very early origins. We've evolved a lot, of course, since 2004, but that was how we came to be, and that's how we ended up doing the policy and political advocacy work that we do today.
And it seems that CJPME has actually become a prominent voice in Canada, not just on issues related to Israel and Palestine, but also on other issues related to human rights and anti-racism.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Fareed, because in fact, in the early years of our organization, the way we had defined our mission is to empower Canadians of all backgrounds to promote justice, development, and peace in the Middle East. We felt that almost was restrictive in terms of we felt like we could only talk about things in the Middle East. But of course, back then people weren't talking about intersectionalism the way they are today. But of course, these things are all interconnected. And so, if you have a situation of oppression in Palestine, or if you have Israel bombing Lebanon, it's very, we need to be able to speak out about what's happening here in Canada. So for instance, in the Israel's 2006 bombing of Lebanon, there was a peace demonstration here in Montreal, and some of the media covered, and they said, well, there are these people that are demonstrating in support of terrorists. And it's like, well, no, people are demonstrating for peace in Montreal, that the Security Council would call for a ceasefire. And so we really felt like there was this interconnectedness, that what goes on in the Middle East influences people's view of Arab Canadians here in Canada, and what happens in Canada influences people's view of what happens in the Middle East. So there's this connectedness, this intersectionality. And so we actually changed our mission to add, justice, peace in the Middle East, as well as here in Canada, so that we could address these issues. Another great example of this type of thing is, of course, the situation we have here in Canada, especially in Quebec, with Islamophobia. You know, my colleagues and I, we actually, you know, literally visibly noticed the upsurge in Islamophobia in Quebec over the past 10 years. When we started CJPME, the Islamophobia wasn't nearly as bad in Quebec as it is today, or as it was 2 years ago. And my anecdotal feeling is that people were horrified by the images, by the things that they heard about the Islamic State and its activities in war-torn Syria, and they then transferred that horror onto the Muslim population in Canada. Totally unfairly, of course, because many of the people who are Muslim in Canada have actually fled that sort of violence before, you know, in coming to Canada. And of course, the Islamic State's victims, before they murdered their first Western journalists, they'd been murdering hundreds and hundreds of Muslims in Syria. And so it was very important to us to be able to speak out about, say, Islamophobia as another example here in Canada. And what's really very satisfying and thrilling from my perspective is that we have a board which really sees that connectedness. And we had a review. CJPME had been working on the Islamophobia issue for a few years. And a year and a half ago, I queried my board, said, look, guys, you know, we've been doing this. What's your feeling? Would you like us to continue? Do you see this as being part of the mandate? And the response was overwhelmingly yes, that this is essential to what CJPME is and what we need to continue to do, in addition to our human rights work with war-torn areas in the Middle East.
Given CJPME's founding as an organization that addressed issues related to Israel's occupation and oppression of Palestinians, could you provide a perspective on how the situation of the Palestinians has evolved since CJPME was founded, and whether the Canadian government is being honest or sincere in its approach to dealing with Israel's treatment of Palestinians?
Well, sure. I think the first part is going to be easier to talk about than the second part, or is going to be more. My answer is going to be more clear. There's been a number of changes, some for the worse and some for the better. You know, as I say, we were founded officially in 2004 as CJPME. A number of things that have happened have worsened the situation. Of course, is the blockade of Gaza was brought into place in 2006 after free and fair elections in Palestine, where Hamas was elected to govern, and the international community just rejected that outcome of the political process, and as a result, they blockaded the Gaza Strip. So that definitely was a downturn. There's been much increased colonization of the West Bank by Israel. Of course, I mentioned this. Of course, it's illegal. It's illegal to colonize territory that you occupy militarily. There was the failure of negotiations under Obama. Of course, a number of people no longer feel like a two-state solution is viable anymore. But for better or worse, the Obama administration was trying that, and those broke down when the Israelis walked away from the table. Of course, then you had the Trump years, where a lot of things took a downturn. The U.S. moved its embassy to Jerusalem, breaking with the tradition of not recognizing Israel's illegal annexation of Jerusalem. The Trump administration legitimized Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights. They also ended their funding to the Palestinian Authority and to UNRWA, the UN organization that supports Palestinian refugees. And they pushed for a peace plan that actually didn't consult the Palestinians at all. So a lot of very negative things, unfortunate things have happened since we began in 2004. We're hoping that the Biden administration will reverse some of the pretty awful things that happened under the Trump administration. On the good side, the launch of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement began in 2005, or that's when it was launched, when you had 170 organizations from Palestinian civil society launch that. I feel like there's greater awareness of Israel's abuses. Israel has launched, in the past 15 years, has launched several ill-advised assaults, especially on Gaza in 2007, 2008, 2009, in 2014. were the two worst, but there have been several smaller assaults on Gaza. And I think people are more aware of, that it's 40, 50 years ago, there was this sort of thought of, well, Israel is the David in a Middle East of Goliaths. But now it's clear that Israel is the Goliath, Israel is the bully, Israel is the powerhouse, and they're just bullying the Palestinians and denying them their rights. And again, on the positive side, it looks like there may be an International Criminal Court investigation that may move forward to investigate Israeli and Palestinian crimes. One of the things that is often missed in the coverage is that the Israel International Criminal Court, this is relatively recent news. They got clearance that they could investigate things that had happened during Israel's 2014 assault on Gaza. The actual investigation will include investigation both of Israeli actions and Israeli officials, as well as Palestinian. But for some reason, there's only a focus on the fact that they're investigating Israelis. And of course, Israel is doing everything they can to stop this. And I, like many others, say, look, if they have nothing to hide, why are they so concerned about this going ahead? And of course, there was the Security Council Resolution 2334 in 2016, right at the end of the Obama years, where the United States roundly condemned in the Security Council, the entire Security Council roundly condemned Israel's illegal colonization of the Palestinian territories. So those are some of the good and bad. One point I'll make as I wrap up that time is not on the Palestinian side, and sometimes we forget that. But let's face it, there's a certain amount of donor fatigue. There's a certain amount of political fatigue on behalf of on the part of the international community. And you have, a humanitarian situation like what we have right now in Yemen. And it's hard to say, well, we need to continue, our 56th year of supporting Palestinian refugees, rather than saying, well, there's this terrible new thing going on in Yemen and we need to divert money there. So time is not on the side of Palestinians, both on the humanitarian side as well as on the political side. It almost becomes a joke, that not a joke, but sometimes people almost treat it facetiously in terms of, well, concerned about the Middle East, or when will there be peace in the Middle East type of thing. And so I think people just sort of get tired of hearing about conflict in the Middle East. So, and I think Israel, being the stronger party, is able to take advantage of this period more so than the Palestinians. We need to be careful that we don't assume that the international aid and the international from governments is going to be indefinite, and we need to do what we can to bring this to a just conclusion as soon as possible. In terms of whether or not the Canadian government is transparent and sincere in its efforts, it's hard to make a good case for that. The Liberal government is far better than the Conservative government has been under the Harper years. Nevertheless, Liberal government really does not walk the talk. Canada has officially on its website, on its foreign affairs website, or I guess they call it global affairs now, they have a relatively balanced official position on the Israel-Palestine conflict. However, from a day-to-day perspective, the Liberal government just does not live up to that policy. They are very quick to criticize any rights violation on the part of the Palestinians, and almost never criticize any rights violations on the part of the Israelis. One of the things that bothers me most is all of the Canadian parties have this policy. They say, we believe, when you press them on things, and when you ask them questions, they say things like, we believe in a negotiated two-state solution that will lead to peace and security for both peoples. But the thing is, there are not negotiations going on right now. So what do we do while negotiations are not occurring? Do we just let the more powerful party beat up on the less powerful party, which is what's happening? Do we let Israel continue to seize Palestinian land? Do we let Israel continue to illegally colonize Palestinian land? Do we let Israel continue to restrict the movement and access of Palestinians to their land and their livelihoods? And so this platitude, we believe in a negotiated two-state solution. Well, that's great. Let's we're all for getting negotiations going, but what are you going to do for the moment, for now?
Yeah,
and
you actually, sorry to interrupt. You actually make a very
No.
good point about the power imbalance, and it seems that we're seeing some of that power imbalance play out around the world in Western countries as it relates to the definition of anti-Semitism, because you have many
Yeah.
pro-Israel organizations in Canada and other Western nations trying to pressure Western governments and institutions like universities to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, which includes defining anti-Semitism as any legitimate political criticism of the government of Israel and its treatment of Palestinians. So I want to ask, how has CJPME been active on this issue, and what do you think adoption of this definition would mean for legitimate political debate on issues related around Israel and Palestine?
Yeah. Well, I think for people that are sort of interested in this question, it's important to actually go to the IHRA website. I guess it's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Yeah. I would encourage you to actually go to their website, and I think it's on their homepage. Look it up yourself to understand what's significant about it. We're all opposed to anti-Semitism. I know you are, Fareed. We certainly are. It's a terrible, terrible thing with a terrible historic record in terms of it's just throughout history. There, Jews have been oppressed and mistreated and excluded and massacred because of anti-Semitism. So we all oppose it. On the other hand, we cannot let people who are simply partisans of Israel redefine anti-Semitism as being simple criticism of Israel. And the problem with the IHRA definition, I have a number of Jewish friends and talked with members of a number of Jewish organizations who say, we don't necessarily think that the definition is the best, but it's passable. There are better definitions, certainly, of anti-Semitism. But the biggest problem with the IHRA definition is that in addition to the definition itself, which seems relatively innocuous, in addition to the definition itself, they provide 11 examples of what they say, examples of what anti-Semitism is. And of those 11 examples, 7 of them refer to Israel and refer to Zionism. And as one of my friends pointed out, if Canadians are concerned about anti-Semitism in in Canada, like we should be, we are Canadians, we operate in Canada, we should be concerned about anti-Semitism is in Canada, and we certainly stand against it. But if that's the concern, why do 7 of the 11 examples refer to Israel and Zionism? So that's really the problem with the definition, is that this is sort of, it's an attempt by partisans or supporters of Israel to actually outlaw criticism of Israel. And it's sort of a backdoor way of sort of making criticism of Israel taboo or making it unacceptable. And CJPME has published a number of different things. My colleague here at CJPME, Michael Bookert, published an article a month or two ago, which actually shows all the different, I think 11 different ways in which the IHRA, we say IHRA, the IHRA definition has been specifically used, or people have said that the IHRA definition could eliminate this type of speech, referring to relatively straightforward speech criticizing Israel's human rights abuses against the Palestinians. I encourage you guys to, I encourage your audience to look up that article by my colleague Michael Bookert, because it actually cites Canadian examples and demonstrates specifically how people are saying the IHRA definition would outlaw this type of speech, which is very legitimate speech. So in terms of our involvement, I first, before I talk about our involvement, I think the people that are leading the charge in terms of opposing the IHRA definition here in Canada is our friend, as our partner organization, Independent Jewish Voices Canada. They're a fantastic organization of progressive Jewish Canadians who have been watching this issue for many years. We too have seen this issue. The issue emerged in other countries, or this definition was being pushed in other countries before it came to Canada. So we knew it was coming. So Independent Jewish Voices Canada, IJV, we call them, they've been leading the charge and doing a great job mobilizing Canadians to sort of oppose this. And we've tried to support them as best we can. We've written a number of different letters, made a lot of statements and press statements on this, mobilized our people through social media and otherwise to get people to stand up against this. It's a little bit like that game Whack-A-Mole. I don't know if you know it
Yeah. Yeah.
in the fairs. Where the thing pops up and you hit it with a little hammer, and another one pops up and you have to keep hitting it in these. And so supporters of Israel are trying to get this IRA definition passed all over the place in provincial legislatures, in city councils and things. I just heard, for instance, earlier today that there's going to be an effort next week to get some sort of statement on the IRA definition passed in Montreal City Council. And so we've got to sort of mobilize ourselves and try to convince those city councilors to not pass the IRA definition. But if they want to pass a definition about anti-Semitism, to consider some of the other excellent definitions of anti-Semitism without encroaching on free speech around Palestinian human rights or Israeli abuses.
Turning to things here in Canada, this past year, since the murder of George Floyd in the U.S., we've seen a heightened public awareness about racism in this country. However, it seems that certain political leaders across the country, including Quebec's premier, don't believe that there is a systemic racism problem within their jurisdictions. This is despite the fact that 6 members of the Muslim community were murdered by a white supremacist while worshiping at a Quebec City mosque in January 2017, despite violent incidents of hate in every part of the country, and despite repeated incidents of police brutality across the country targeting Indigenous, Black, and Brown people. In light of all this, if you were sitting down face to face with some of these political leaders, or let's say you were sitting down face to face with Quebec Premier Francois Legault, who seems to be blind to racism, what would your message be to him?
Yeah, it's a great question, Fareed. Well, the first thing I try to do is I try to talk about facts. I think it's very important that we have fact-based policy, and unfortunately, a lot of these policies that like some of the ones, Bill 21 here in Quebec, a lot of these policies are simply not based on fact. There's a myth that sort of immigrants have a higher rate of unemployment or a higher rate of crime. That's just simply false. Immigrants are very hardworking people, and and have very low levels of crime. They're here to make a new life for themselves. They're not here to sort of take advantage of Canadian Canadians in any way. So there's that. There's also facts that show that immigrants are not trying to impose their own values, but came to Canada because they love what Canada stands for. So I think in terms of the facts, I challenge politicians who push these policies, say, look, there's no facts, there's no literal facts that actually support the implementation of these fear-mongering policies. In terms of Bill 21, which is Quebec Francois Legault's government's attempt to prevent people with deep religious faith from wearing any religious garb. There was literally no example of, say, a Muslim trying to proselytize while on the job in a position of authority in Quebec. So these are, they're sort of creating this sort of response to a problem that doesn't even exist. So I'd say, look, there's just these facts. Will you face these facts? Now, I think sometimes these politicians, they're not actually interested in the facts, and that's a very sad thing, and that's a very dangerous thing for a democracy when politicians prefer to actually play on people's fears rather than develop facts-based policy. And so. And I think that's what's happening with Legault, is that he felt that he could mobilize, he could get elected if he mobilized people based on their fear, if he promised them that he was going to somehow crack down on Quebec's Muslim Canadian minority. So in cases like that, where you have people that literally they're governing or their policies based on myths and not fact. What we do in our advocacy work and say, look, do you believe, we just sort of challenge them on their core beliefs. Do you personally believe that all people deserve the same civil liberties in our society? And get them really to express themselves, to articulate exactly what they're feeling. And then it's much harder for them to sort of talk about, well, there's this and there's that. well, what do you believe? What do you believe, Mr. Legault? Do you believe that all Quebecers should have the right to practice their religion as they see fit, as long as, that sort of thing. So that's the way I would challenge them. The sad thing, I think, the saddest thing is that Legault has to a large degree gone unchallenged. Just because you get a minority, when he was first elected, one of the things that he said is basically, he said he was elected, he was given a mandate to crack down, to prevent people from wearing religious symbols in their positions of authority. Even though it's been going on for decades and decades, long before you had much of a Muslim Quebec population. You've had nuns wearing their habit, and people wearing crosses around their necks, and Orthodox Jews wearing certain religious garb, and nobody had an issue with it until the past few years, when there was this big wave of Islamophobia. But one of the things that I think is most important is that just because you have a majority that is fearful of a certain minority, that does not give you the right as an elected leader to then restrict the rights of the minority. In fact, as a majority, your role is actually to protect the rights of the minorities.
Yes, actually, of course, and we've seen historically what the situation is when you have politicians who cater to fear. I think obviously Nazi Germany is the prime example. Of course, today we've got the situation with the Rohingya in Myanmar. We've got a similar situation. We've only got a few minutes left, so I'd like to just mention, of course, 2020 is going to be a year that's going to be long remembered for many reasons beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. Last year, we had huge public anti-racism demonstrations around the world, and a public dialogue about racism following the murder of George Floyd in the US. Civil liberties and human rights activists in Canada and other Western countries have been talking about racism and hate and xenophobia like never before. And in Canada, since last spring, we've seen various stories in mainstream media and social media about blatant acts of racism against minority individuals and communities. One example, in Toronto, a Muslim man was murdered by a white supremacist when he was stabbed in front of a mosque as he was sitting there. We've also seen public statements by politicians which are clearly racist. And we continually see individuals on social media and far-right and Islamophobic websites that promote hate and enable and encourage racist elements in society. Based on your experience and the work that you've done, what do you think this says about the state of our society and culture when it comes to issues of human rights, the equality of citizenship, and the place of minority communities in our country?
Yeah. Well, Canada is a flawed country. We've been highly flawed since our founding. So I think I think people that sort of harken back to what Canada was, or Canada has always been a racist country, or Canadians and their leaders have always have in the past frequently implemented and tolerated racist policies. We see this very clearly with Canada's treatments of its Indigenous people. So this is, I should say, nothing new. I think the challenge here is that a lot of people have sort of ignored Canada's racist history with its Indigenous people, and think of Canada as this nice, benevolent country. Now, I'm not saying that every Canadian, including me and you, Farid, I'm not saying that we're all these monsters and just sort of running around and being mean to people and bullying people. But as a society, Canada has permitted these things to go on and on. I mean, as individuals, everyone has their good side and bad side, and we all we love our neighbors, we love our family, we love our people in our community. So it's this broader acceptance and tolerance of mistreatment of minorities. So we're flawed in many of the same ways that the U.S. is flawed. Maybe it's a little bit more subtle here, but we have many of the same. We've done many of the same things, and we have some of the many of the same weaknesses. Democracy is fragile. I am fearful that we'll start if certain people have their way, that you'll start to have the polarization in Canada that you do right now in the United States. I think there are a few things that are still protecting us. and that it's not going to be quite as easily for us to slide into the same place where the U.S. finds itself right now. But we need to be careful. So there are lots of things that we need to deal with as a country in terms of the human rights, equality of citizenship, and the place of minority communities. I think there's a number of reasonable initiatives out there. The M103 report that came out in 2018 was excellent in terms of addressing bigotry against minorities. I think in the bigger picture, though, in terms of resisting this polarization, which then just leads to mistreatment of minorities. Some of the things that we need to do is we need to have better social media accountability. I think there's some good things happening in terms of pressuring social media companies to be better about combating online hate, but we need to be careful with that as well, because we don't want to, we need to make sure that we target the right kind of behavior that needs to be controlled, rather than having a broad brush removing all free speech. We need better media accountability. We need to help our media. The media has been very much hurt in the past several years because they've been defunded as all the advertising money has gone to social media. So we need an independent media that's able to hold politicians accountable. We also need to maintain and strengthen our campaign financing laws. I mean, you look at the things happening in the States. Part of the reason you have these things happening in the States is because the campaign finance laws are just way too they make it way too easy for special interests to wield just crazy power, and especially wealthy money to wield crazy power in the States. And of course we need to maintain our processes of defining the way we're represented in terms of our ridings and so on, to make sure that currently Canada has a very good system in terms of establishing the way ridings are drawn. We don't have the gerrymandering that you see in the United States. So these things are essential in terms of protecting us from the polarization that you see right now in the States. But in general, we just have to do better. We have to, when the Liberal government says they're going to implement the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was done to look at Canada's treatment of its Indigenous peoples, and then they don't act on that, we need to hold them accountable. When the Trudeau government says they're going to, talk about electoral reform, we need to hold them accountable, because under our current electoral process, many of our voices, especially minority voices, are simply not heard. That to some degree their votes are lost or wasted because they never get the representation that they deserve. And then another example is the M103 report that I mentioned a moment ago. How serious is the government in terms of implementing some of those protections so that Canada's minorities truly can benefit from a helping hand from the federal government, and better protections and better understanding from the broader Canadian community.
Well, Tom, we've come to the end of our conversation, but as you and I know, I'm sure we could continue on for hours talking about these things.
Yeah.
I would like to thank you very much for joining us on Diversity Dialogue and touching on the topics that you did. I think these are issues that are very important, that need to be continued to be discussed, and certainly groups like yours need to, and other human rights and anti-racism activist groups need to be out there doing this work on a regular basis if we want to build the sort of civil society that we all hope for.
Absolutely.
Once again, to the audience out there who is watching this, I'd like to thank you for joining me for this edition of Diversity Dialogue. Please join us next time. We will post another one in due time, and thank you.